wow. If you hit go live before you think of what you're going to say, that really just looks silly. So, hello, friends. Welcome back to .NET API Review. The list requires scrolling now, so we'll see how much we can burn through today, and before too long, we may have to decide that we need more meetings to burn this down in real time, but we'll see how long we can stick with one a week. All right, first up, use add random probabilistic sampler instead of add probabilistic sampler. .NET extensions 5.9 or 5.5.
Okay, so if you remember, probabilistic sampler was approved last week, and it's good. But then we received additional feedback from OpenTelemetry.net folks, and they're debating, and they're considering, they're really considering this probabilistic word for use in future. In near future, I would say, and they recommend to avoid it, to avoid using probabilistic sampler as such. But we internally discussed, and we have come up with this slightly updated name, and proposing to add a new word, instead of probabilistic sampler, it should be random probabilistic sampler, and it is fine with OpenTelemetry folks.
Is random and probabilistic, are these like synonyms, or does one describe the other in some meaningful way?
Yeah, so good question. So I'm not a native, not a native English speaker, but we internally discussed, and some folks, I think Noah, said that they are not synonymous, and
yeah,
probabilistic.
If you can scroll at the end of the issue, I mean, Noah's comment there answering this question. Yeah.
Sorry, so what's the distinction between the two words? Like, what does the one convey that the other doesn't, or vice versa?
So OpenTelemetry have another sampler. It's called consistent probability sampler. So they use consistent with probability, which is like, if random and probability is synonyms, I mean, like, so they shouldn't use consistent probability. This is why I mean, like,
it's not all contextual, right? Like, you could have a consistent rate of random samples, right? Which would maybe still be probabilistic.
So do you think every probabilistic is random?
I think so. I mean, I'm interested in the counter.
So what this means, consistent probability then?
Did you say consistent probabilistic?
Apparently OTel uses that, reading the lower comment.
Right.
I can't even think of what that would mean.
I mean, I think it's what I said, right? Like, if you're sampling like 10% of logs randomly, like that sampling rate of 10% is consistent. They're not changing it to 50% or something. It's still, that's my guess, not having read the document that they linked to.
Okay, so just to go back about like the whole point, for renaming this one, because like we need to avoid the conflict of the naming with the OpenTelemetry. They have the similar name but different sampler. So if you have a better word for it, I mean, or better name, I mean, we can consider it. So the best we came up with was this one, random probabilistic sampler.
Right. So probabilistic by itself is off the table. So like, what about random by itself?
But I think we briefly talked about random last week or the week before that, and I think the conclusion was that it is too generic, maybe. Like it does not convey enough information, if I remember correctly.
Mike suggested stochastic.
I mean, it's a good word in that like 150 people on the planet at any given point know what it means.
and maybe fewer know how to spell it. So yeah.
So if I thought probabilistic was adding anything on top of random, then I might be more against add random sampler. Like, you know, if there's another word we can add that like describes this better or in more detail, that's fine. I just think add random probabilistic sampler is just as vague as add random sampler. So you might as well choose the shorter one. It's easier to type.
Levi, I know you have opinions about the word random. How do you feel about random probabilistic and or random?
I don't really have strong feelings on it as long as it's documented what random means. In this particular case, I'm pretty sure people would be able to get from context that it's not a CS PRNG. So I don't have strongly held opinions on it in this case.
Yeah, I don't. So I looked and I don't see. I didn't write down any notes of why, if random came up as a proposed name, why we didn't take it. Because you know, often things that get proposed and don't get accepted don't make it into the notes. But the add random sampler, like I like probabilistic, but if you're having a naming conflict with a similar but different thing, then add random seems nicer to me.
But does it tell about like this is probabilities sample? I mean, like,
but the word
is every random
sampling,
is probabilities?
but doesn't the word sampling already infer that though, or imply that?
Yeah, but sampler can work in different ways. I mean, there are different algorithms run with the samplers. So you have to describe which sampler you did.
Yeah.
So for sure, we are using probability for this sampler. So yeah, the only thing is like we need to distinguish it between this one and the open telemetry one. That's all. At the end,
I mean, this name at random probabilistic is not the worst thing in the world, even though it is a little, you know, a little verbose, but
I just don't understand. Like, sorry, it seems like you're pretty hard against add random sampler because it doesn't imply probability. Is that the objection? Like, random doesn't imply that there's probabilities involved?
Yeah, I mean, like if I see random, I wouldn't think about like there is any probability used there. It's just random.
Like 50%? No, like, I guess. Like, I mean, I feel like there's always a probability involved, like when you're doing randomness somewhere. There's like got to be something defining the
Generating
distribution.
random number is not probability, right? I mean, like
I feel like
never.
it is. Like you have a distribution over the sample space, and it has a probability of being each value in the Like you know, I don't
No,
know.
we are using seeds. I mean, you use the seed and calculate the random from it, and that's it. It's not really probability, right? Anyway, I mean, like I'm not good in naming in general, so I'm not trying to push back on any proposal here. Just I want to make sure that like whatever we go with, I mean, it makes sense for what we have here.
Yeah, I'm fine, I guess. Like, you know, not my hill to die on, but like when I read add random sampler, like I just like how would it not be probabilistic? Like there's obviously some probability involved. Like it's some percent of the logs that are going to be randomly logged. Like clearly you can
I
define
would
what that percent is.
yeah, I would almost feel better about calling it random probabilistic if it actually took a system.random object in its config options. But maybe that's just overkill for this design.
But at random, you don't feel it needs that?
I mean, just the word random in general kind of makes me want to tell people like, hey, you can pass in a random. Like it's based on system.random. Here, pass one in. But aside from testing, is there any reason anyone would actually ever want to do that in practice? And the answer is probably no.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, yes, if I saw a thing and it was like, oh, and we're doing random sampling, then I'd either be like, whatever, just do it, or be like, so how do I control the thing? It's like, oh, right here, double probability, done.
Yep.
So at probabilistic, I'm probably slightly more looking for it, and at random probabilistic, it just feels like, hey, those are the same word. Why'd you put them twice?
I completely feel that way. Yeah, and like also we have what's was originally approved as like the probabilistic sampler filter rule dot probability. Like I assume it's not. Yeah. So there are the options. Sorry, I glanced over them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the type names are fine without probabilistic as well. Like, I think it's very clear.
Yeah. I mean, the other one that actually hasn't been put on screen but was said and came up in chat again was the stochastic. I'd actually have to look up the definition to see if it's actually correctly applied, but
it is.
thank you.
Do we even use that word anywhere else in the framework?
Probably not.
It's one of those words that you find in like a lot of math and other areas in scientific domains, but I don't think it's one of those words that a typical programmer is expected to know and understand.
Yeah, I see it in the machine learning namespace, and that's it. Nowhere else.
The machine learning dot probabilistic namespace, no less.
Yes.
But,
Notably, I don't like the name just random sampler because I find random sampling to be different from probabilistic sampling.
what's random sampling in your mind?
Completely random.
So like 1-0 binary random.
Yeah, like imagine you have a graph. A random sample means that if you randomly create samples for a graph, they can appear anywhere on the graph. Whereas probabilistic sampling follows a probabilistic curve typically. And so while there's generally some noise to it, you have that general curve on which the probabilities are distributed. So you're not going to really find them anywhere. You're going to find them along the probable location.
So when you described a random sampler there of picking like a completely arbitrary point on the graph, like you're still implying that there's like an even chance of any part of the graph being selected, right? I mean, there's some defined distribution, and then like in this case, right, we're not picking a single sample; it's a sampler. So like this would be using random samples sample, say, 50% of the graph or something like that. Like, would it not?
The rule itself is providing probability. I mean, so it provides you like the kind of percentage, and this is not random. I mean, like by itself, it's not random, right?
I feel like it's very much random. Like, if it was every other, right? Like, if it was like round robin or something, then it wouldn't be random. That would still be like probabilistic also implies random, right? Like, right? Like, so I mean, but like you could have a sampler that's not random that had the same rate. It wouldn't be probabilistic, and that's kind of the thing here, right? Like, random and probabilistic are saying the same thing about the sampler. Like, it's not every 10, it's some subset, and it's picked randomly. That's what it means to be probabilistic.
So when I hear probabilistic, I specifically think about probability theory and distribution and things like bell curves. Like the standard problem of you have a bunch of balls and they're in a tank. You flip the tank upside down and they drop down. They hit the pegs that are distributed amongst the graph, and then there is theoretically a random chance that they fall either way. But the actual setup is that you get this probabilistic bell curve. The probability forms the curve, and that's different from necessarily true randomness, which should more realistically result in kind of an even distribution.
I mean, the even distribution, the bell curve distribution, the exponential distribution, those are all in math random functions. Like, most things in nature are bell curved, so a lot of people tend toward bell curves, but the others are all equally valid mathematically speaking. Probability does not mean bell curve. In fact, probability usually means linear. The bell curve is a way of doing what is the deviation from the norm.
And so that's in general my reasoning, though, of why, if I hear random, and the way that most people, I think, interpret random is that given nothing else, you have an even chance of distribution anywhere. So more akin to linear, whereas the probabilistic makes me think more like bell curve, because that's what probability theory gets into for normal stuff. And there are different types of distribution on top of that, like normal or Poisson or any of the other ones, gamma distributions and things like that.
So I agree that a random distribution doesn't need to be flat. But even if you did think that, like, isn't this like doing a flat kind of sampling? There's no kind of like interesting curve here, right? Like, every single element has the same random probability of getting selected. So it would seem like an argument for random, like what you just said about random being more flat. But like, I disagree with the premise as well.
I think the issue is calling it just random sampler.
I mean, random probabilistic is fine. It's just a mouthful. But if it more properly conveys things, then like we're kind of splitting hairs at this point, right?
That's true. Like, it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of us feel like it's long-winded, but unless anybody has a real objection, we can just take it.
But it's also one of those things you only do once.
Go ahead, Tanner.
Is this tied to a specific probability distribution algorithm? Like, is it normal versus gamma versus
it's linear,
something else?
It's just the linear distribution of system.random dot give me a double between 0 and 1, which is slightly off linear, but it's close enough to linear.
Should this be called maybe add random linear sampler then, so that it can be expanded in the future to other samplers if needed?
No. Like, I feel like that's way too in the weeds. And why would you, like, linear's good enough? Like, would you ever change? Why? Like, what would it even be based on?
One of the like 50 other distribution algorithms that people commonly use and that do get built into core libraries, like gamma distribution, is part of the C standard because it's fairly
So-
common.
How do you use the gamma distribution to select logs?
That I don't know. I'm just
That's
asking
like
because
what I'm
we're
getting at.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
yeah.
what's interesting here is that you're making a decision based on each incoming element, I believe, without any type of knowledge about what elements came before or which will come after. So you can't really do a normal distribution in that sense.
Yeah, they're all independent, like I would imagine.
Which means linear is pretty much the only thing that even really makes sense at that point.
Yep. So, I mean, throwing names out that have come up, add linear sampler, add linear random sampler, add uniform random sampler, add
I think about talking about linearity or uniformity or the sample distribution shape or whatever is just like meaningless. Like there's one reasonable way to like randomly sample logs. You check whether like rand.get number is less than or greater than a value and go from there.
Yeah. But also kind of to what I was saying earlier, isn't this something that you basically just do an app start? So even if it's a little verbose, like, well, it only occurs in one file in your entire code base.
Yeah, I'm not willing. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm willing to give up. I slightly preferred random over random probabilistic, but given that we didn't quickly reach consensus, let's just approve it.
Alright, so random probabilistic it is.
Good to me.
No, hold the presses. I believe I suggested Monte Carlo sampler. No.
It's not a
that
Monte
in
Carlo
any API?
thing. No. It's not Monte Carlo.
So when I looked up stochastic sampling, most of the things were talking about a Monte Carlo approach to image processing, and it's like, all right, maybe that's not the best word.
See, this is why we should make the chat available to YouTube, because it's fun to troll people.
Nope. Gotta get rid of that thought experiment line. All right. Going once, twice. Sold. Thanks for putting up with our nonsense, feature crew.
Okay, thank you.
All right. HybridCache, use a span-based fetch. This is .NET Runtime 112866. I didn't poke Mark, so I'm guessing he didn't show up today. That's just my bad. Does anybody know enough about this to talk about it, or do we just skip it?
Probably skip it.
Okay. All right. Obsolete XsltSettings enable script 108287. So I've looked into this because I was curious about it, and this boolean, if you set it to true, it goes through many layers and then throws. You're not allowed to turn this on core. So the proposal is, since setting it to true will always throw on core, we should just mark it as obsolete.
Yeah. Are there? You said it goes through many layers. Does that imply that there might be other properties that need to be obsoleted as well?
That I can't answer.
Okay.
Just it gets passed through, so it wasn't like, it's not the setter itself throws if you set true. It's like eventually when it gets to a part where it's deciding if it should do something, it asks, is this true? And then goes, hey, wait a minute, it wasn't allowed to be true.
I see. Should we make the setter throw as well, or is that maybe a little too extreme? If you set it to true, that is.
I mean, that would have made sense to me. I don't know why it's not the approach we went with, other than maybe somebody just thinking that if you never get to the part where it cared.
Well, I'm thinking about what you did with some of the crypto APIs, where you can set like the use legacy HMAC value or whatever, and if you set it to true, even if you never intend on using the actual object that the value has been set to true on, that throws an exception. So you did proactively guard against people doing silly things there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So.
And I wonder if maybe this is a similar case.
So this is the main one of, it doesn't throw until it sees a script block. So at least I assume that's what it's doing here. So if it walks down a big path and then it asks if script is not enabled, then it calls skip, and otherwise it throws.
I see.
So
there are legitimate scenarios where somebody might set it to true, just have forgotten about it, and it never blew up in practice.
Right. So changing the thing to throw early would potentially unnecessarily break people.
Fair. Whereas in the case I just mentioned with the crypto APIs, like there's no reason to even instantiate the type if you're not going to immediately turn around and use it.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing you would have done on that is set it to true and never called compute hash, which would be...
Yeah. Like, why did you do that?
I newed it up, but then didn't want to know what its answer was.
Yes. Okay, fair.
Sounds a lot like newed it up.
Do we have any scenario we pick up the value of this from any configuration? I mean, different than just code?
I only
I'm
ever
just-
see reads, never writes.
Yeah, in fact, this is the only 3 references to the property, and they're all reads. So...
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking old XML.
Right.
I'm not too worried about like trying to make it obsolete. Like worst case we're wrong, it'll be like, oh, it's no longer obsolete.
Yeah, I mean, changing it to throw early, I think, is above and beyond. I mean, if Christoph or whoever's responsible for XML this week wants to, I don't think we'd object, but I don't think we should exit with a recommendation that they move the throw to the property setter. So, given that it doesn't seem to have a valid use in core, does anyone have an objection to obsoleting the property?
No. Though I do see three queries to the property, and only one of them throws. The other 2 look like they actually do something useful.
Yeah, I mean,
So
we can... the person who marked it ready for review was Jeff, not Christoph, so...
right.
I mean, if we approve the notion of obsoleting it and Christoph comes back and says, but that's not actually right, then he can certainly not obsolete it.
That's true. Yeah. It's just I wouldn't want to obsolete it if there are scenarios that actually do work within core. And just judging from the call sites, it looks like there might be some limited scenarios that do still work.
Is there anything wrong with obsoleting? If we do want to obsolete it, would be obsoleting just the setter, or are we obsoleting the whole thing? So presumably we can actually make the getter work.
I think in the past,
the getter
we've
just returns
obsoleted
the
the whole setter, haven't we? Yeah.
You mean the whole property? Yeah. I
Yeah, the whole
assume we
property.
can put the obsolete on just the set, but
Obsoleting just a setter seems like weird. Like, how does that show up in like learning.microsoft.com and stuff? Like, I don't see the need to do anything not super normal if we want to obsolete this. Like, if we don't want you setting it, then like reading it is like an obsolete scenario too. And if
Well,
we
that's not
have
necessarily
code
true.
that if that's
If you're making a decision based on whether the scripting is enabled, that's reading it, and we can give you a perfectly valid answer. No, it's not enabled.
Yeah, but
If you're
assembly name, for instance, where we've obsoleted properties on there, is we've said that the property always returns some value, even if the value was set by the setter. But the obsolete message clearly says, like, you should never be looking at this property anyway, because the property as a whole is just obsolete. Like, if we didn't think that compiling scripts was interesting in XSLT scenarios to the point where we literally ripped the functionality out, then that also means that somebody querying if it's enabled is not really a legitimate scenario.
exactly.
Because I don't see that. If I ask whether I can rely on something or not, getting back an answer of false is a perfectly reasonable thing, and I shouldn't have to change my code to avoid getting warnings about that. Because I mean, yes, I could rip out the code at that point, but is that really something we want to issue a warning about, that you have dead code?
Well,
Well, by the
presumably,
same theory,
yeah, go ahead.
oh, sorry. The same theory, like the setter could theoretically be useful too if like I'm the one on the other end reading it later to do something useful. But like you're
But the
saying,
the
as a
setter
framework-
implies that you're turning this on to enable certain behaviors that you then rely on. So marking that obsolete makes sense, because you can't actually rely on the fact when you set this, but you can rely on the results from getting it.
You can, but what are you going to do with that result, though? Like, presumably you have an if and an else block, and one of those two blocks is starting to enter a scenario where, like, we've told people you shouldn't be doing this.
Right. One of those two blocks is dead code, but we don't issue warnings for dead code. This is a warning.
We do.
We issue informational diagnostics for dead code.
But I like looking at the obsolescence we've already put on other types, like assembly name, like the crypto type Jeremy mentioned. Like, we always do it on the overall property, never just a setter. Like, what we do is we tell people this, given the fact that the functionality itself is kind of dead, like the getter just doesn't really make sense to call.
yeah,
Like, you should just remove this whole thing from your code.
So I mean, here's one of the ones that we're talking about, which has a very clear. There's no point in reading this on core.
Yeah.
But on this one, it was also a like 0 utilization. Like, nobody was calling it. I haven't looked at the compat data to see. I'll see if we have it in the APIs of right now. But
feel free to look at assembly name as well, because we have tons of obsolete properties on those, on that type. Even though a lot of those properties return meaningful values, they're obsoleted because we tell people, like, yeah, you're going to get some non-null, non-empty string value back, but like, why are you doing this? Like, stop looking at me.
right? And I don't think the kind of learning documentation line should like be ignored either. Like, people are used to looking at things at the property level, not the getter setter level.
Yeah.
And so people, yeah, let's stick with the pattern that we've done. Like, I don't think the scenario of like, oh, maybe we could read this property that should always be false now, right? Like, and that's somehow useful. Like, I just okay, silence the warning. Like, I don't think many people should be doing that. We'd be happy if they didn't.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking there was legitimate use of like you're just printing all the status, and now it tells you like, ooh, don't don't print that. But like, this is registering as 0.
Yeah.
I mean, interestingly, it's the non-zero 0. It's because unless this has changed recently, if it's literally 0, the row doesn't show up, but it's so low that it becomes 0.0%. So yeah, the hover text here says 0.002%. So that's like one hit in all of Upgrade Planner.
I mean, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, and then it doesn't matter what we do here.
Exactly. So,
But this is like the general thing, right? Like when obsoleting properties, like I think it's a worthwhile discussion. Hopefully we kind of reached, maybe we shouldn't block on it if nothing needs to know, but like, yeah, I agree in principle. Whole properties should be obsoleted unless it's like a really unique scenario.
I just don't know. I mean, we can stop talking about it now if we're not going to change our minds about this, but I don't know why we consider that precedent. There's 2 discrete pieces of functionality that are wrapped up into, one syntax for defining them. One is about getting the current state of something. One is about changing the current state of something, and we can get the current state very reasonably. At that point, it just becomes, are you alerting people to whether they have dead code or not? And I'm hesitant to issue warnings for dead code when we pretty much always do it as an opt-in informational thing. But whatever.
It's not that it's dead code, it's that the architecture of if you're curious enough about the value of this property in order to make a runtime decision based on its value, you're probably working that decision somehow into the architecture of your component or your application, and you need to be alerted to the fact that this thing that you've worked into your application is not going to work how you think it does.
I don't think that's true. I mean, you would have 2 branches for something like this. That's a Boolean. You have 2 branches, one of which you will always do the right thing, and one of which will never be invoked. And you're
if you're
accounting
reasonable,
for a possibility that doesn't exist.
Yeah, and if you're reasonable,
Yeah,
the true is throw.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good.
I mean, if no one calls
sense.
us, it doesn't matter. We can obsolete the whole thing.
Yeah.
So clearly, what we need is to add a as info instead of as warning property to obsolete attribute.
I mean, we can do that. It's called an analyzer instead of obsolete, but
Yeah.
Yeah, info on get, warn on set.
Yeah.
all right. So we're leaving it at the property level or going to set. I don't.
At property level, I mean,
don't
that's not going to affect literally anyone other than us, where we
Yeah.
call 3 times. So
But I mean, presumably we would just stop calling it.
right, because we have dead code.
Yeah. Except we would call it because we want to throw. So yeah.
Do we have the same behavior in .NET framework? I mean, like if somebody sets this to true, it will throw.
No, if
No,
somebody
.NET
says through,
framework
it works.
honors it. Yeah.
I'm looking at the implementation now, and maybe this is what you were saying earlier. Why do we think this is? I mean, our code is definitely doing stuff in response to this being set or not set.
The hit in loader is if it's false, skip it, and if it's true, you exit that if and move to the next line, which is an unconditional throw.
But there's 2 other hits. There's one in XSL AST analyzer and one in Kill generator env, and they're both doing things if it's true, changing flags that are passed around and.
Yeah. So in my notes, I say on the assumption or on the basis the property actually has no legitimate value. So that's I guess.
Yeah, because I think the parser always gets hit first before the other two call sites can kick in. But that's something that Christoph or someone else would have to double check. But you are right though. Like there are multiple call sites, two of which do seem to do something interesting.
Which I would believe is just from our core 1 and core 2 of try and keep the code looking as much like framework as possible.
Yeah.
And then this is XML, so nobody went back and touched it and tried gutting things.
Right. My gut tells me that the first thing that says fail prevents the other two from even running, but I don't know.
I start thinking about like what is the risk if we didn't obsolete it in the first place. I mean, like
No one's
Because,
using
like,
it, so
it's-
zero risk.
I mean,
so why
we
you do
don't-
that?
we don't want our API just to kind of, grow old and crusty, right? Like we do want to occasionally prune things that we think are not applicable in 2025, right? And this is, it's basically maintenance of our code base because we are still shipping it.
Yeah, and looks like Christoph did give it a thumbs up. But I don't know if that's due diligence or just a like casual sure, send it off to review. Alright, so yes, obsolete on the basis it doesn't work. If that's not true, then don't obsolete. And in the end, we put it on the property. But mostly we ended the debate because it didn't matter. And if this comes up on a thing that has some actual usage, this probably won't serve as precedent.
So, related question. This is a net standard API. How do we feel about obsoleting APIs that are part of net standard?
This wouldn't touch the net standard pack. This would be if you're compiling only for core or you're dual compiling, then setting it, then touching the property on the core compile will tell you, hey, this is part of net standard API, but it's not actually an everywhere option.
Yeah, but presumably if we are obsoleting something in core that exists in net standard, wouldn't it be prudent for us to tell net standard application or libraries to target net standard, like, hey, you're using an API which probably doesn't work how you think it does?
My recollection is net standard DLL will never be touched again, and this will live inside net standard DLL, so we can't mark it obsolete ever.
Do we not have like analyzers or anything else that accompany net standard?
I mean, we could write analyzers, but we can't mark it obsolete.
Sure. But it's just as a general question, if we have something that we know exists in net standard that we also know doesn't work the same on net effects and net core, presumably we want to surface that somehow.
We used to have and might still have the platform compatibility analyzer. When we were building core 1 and core 2, anything that didn't work across core and framework consistently was supposed to be marked in the PCA. I don't know if this ever made it there. I don't know where it lives now. But we definitely had a thing for basically letting people targeting net standard to know, hey, this may not work in core.
We don't build this library for net standard in our runtime repo. It's just targeting net core.
I'm pretty sure this part of XML is part of net standard, so it's in it's in the .NET/net standard, like it is part of netstandard.dll.
It is, yes.
This is the implementation library, but that doesn't change the targeting pack.
Okay.
So maybe this isn't the particular issue to discuss it then, but it does seem like we need some type of durable answer for like what happens when we make changes to APIs that are part of standard. Like it feels like we really do need to alert our consumers to that somehow through some out-of-band mechanism.
I think analyzers will just help in this issue.
I can spell. There we go. Solve the net standard problem. Put it in the PCA.
Perfect.
How do we add it? So doesn't the platform compatibility analyzer require adding attributes to things?
I mean, it used to just... I thought it was a list of functions that we registered somewhere.
I thought it was just looking for attributes to say whether things work on certain things or don't.
Well, because there's the... Yeah, I mean, the board platform is very overloaded. We have the OS supported things, which just looks at the attributes, but we built that in like Net 5. During Net Core 1, we started an analyzer that somewhere we fed in a list of like member IDs that if you touch this member ID, it would give you a warning of like, this may not work on Core, this may not work on Linux or whatever. It's probably old.
That's the thing that runs as part of. That's the thing that runs as part of whatever the tool was that helps you port. We don't have an analyzer in the SDK that does that, do we?
I know who I would ask. Somebody in chat says the portability analyzer.
Yeah, but that's not part of the SDK, right? That's a separate tool. That's like the upgrade tool.
We have a analyzer built into the SDK that you can enable that allows you to specify that the API surface should be compared against the previous NuGet package, and it will warn about breaks.
Right. But that wouldn't help with net standard.
Right.
To my knowledge, there's nothing that we ship in the .NET SDK where we ship a list of APIs that it will then flag.
Don't we also have the blocked API analyzer, but that wouldn't really cover this either. I think this would mostly be covered by someone who's multi-targeting.
Right. And we don't ship a list of APIs that are defaulted into the blocked API analyzer.
Yeah.
That's for people to write their own lists for their own. You know, I don't like XYZ API, so I'm not going to allow one in my organization to call it.
Yeah, and just to clarify, like this is separate from the whole obsolescence question. This is just like the API doesn't do what you think it does on core question.
Yeah, and if it was, in general, I think you prefaced your comment by saying in general, not necessarily specific to this. In general, yeah, we should consider analyzers for things if an API should not be used, is bogus, does something bad. If we can't find anyone using it, we're not going to invest in writing an analyzer for it.
No, that's totally fair.
Yeah, I don't see in Roslyn analyzers anything that I think would have been in that package. So, all right, I'll remove the bullet if none of us can actually know what it means. All right. So next up, add a void returning encode callback for ASN writer 112675. So previously, we added a callback based encode operation, and we made it be func. And Kevin has run across many places that he then had to return null because we made it func, and so this is just adding one that does action.
The existing one is the exact same signature, except it's func with comma object at the end.
It's func of t. Here, I'm pulling it up. So, encode of state and return takes a func of state and span to return. And so
Is not allowed to return a ref struct?
we didn't allow it to return a ref struct because then that would let you return the span.
Oh, yes, you're right. Okay.
I was opinionated.
Yeah. Good job.
So yeah, it's this same signature, but change func to action and then pop t return out of it because it's no longer used. And there is the fourth option, which I think he points out, which is that we could also add one that doesn't take the state, but he and I both question, why would you be calling an encode callback that you didn't have a state, but you just wanted the span? So
Well, you'd be closing over something.
yeah, you could. So I mean, we can add it.
This is just a question of how easy we want this API to use. If we care about, if we don't care as much about perf, like, is this API exist purely for perf? Is there other APIs that let you achieve the same thing?
The callback based encodes are so that you don't have to allocate the return array.
All right, then.
So yeah, it's just for perf. And once you're being perf,
then requiring the state seems reasonable.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the downsides would, well, yeah. Where is this encoding to? It's encoding to the writer?
So encode is the verb of writer be done now. So you've written a bunch of things into the writer, and then encode is take the final answer and turn it to a series of bytes. And so then this is saying it has that as an internal span, and it'll pass you the span instead of allocating it as an array.
If we did change t-return to be allows ref struct, such that you could just return the input span as the result, you wouldn't actually need the new one, right? Because you could then just call encode, have the span be returned, and use the span outside of the method.
Yeah, but we decided we didn't want you to do that. Otherwise, we would just add a property, otherwise we would just add a method encode to span.
Why don't we want you to do that? Because we don't want to expose the span?
Yeah. Because I have opinions about returning spans, which is don't do it.
Well, it depends what the span is wrapping. It's wrapping something from something like pooled or something reusable from the writer?
It's like list. It's wrapping a currently held array that if you call any of the verbs that modify it may be invalidated.
Okay. And the use cases that we have for this are you're passing in the thing that's going to be mutated based on the state? Based on the bytes? Like, the use for this is the t state that you're passing in is going to somehow be mutated based on the read-only span of byte.
Yeah, it'd be like t state would be like a incremental hash or a stream that you're writing it to or whatever. So it's the place that you want to send the bytes after they were sent through encode.
Seems fine.
The general case as of here is we have a different ASN writer and we wanted to push the value into it. So it's So we pass in the writer and then call write bit string. So it's just for forwarding data, basically.
Yeah, I tested some stuff in a local session just to make sure that adding the new overload wouldn't cause like weird type inference failures, and it looks like it's okay.
It might if the callback never returned, right? If the callback always throws, it might be ambiguous.
Oh, good point. That it chose something. It chooses the action. It chooses the action instead of the func.
Okay.
Good catch, though. So that means that it would in fact be calling a new API. It would be calling the other overload if it always throws. But I'm pretty sure it would have the same behavior under the covers. So
Wait.
that would be okay here.
You said it picked the func?
No, it picks the action.
Yeah, so it would be calling the
new
new one.
Yeah. Right. It changes to call the new one instead of the old one.
Yeah.
Actually, you know what? It never compiled with the old one anyway. Never mind.
Yeah, because it wouldn't have known what the TRET would have been.
What T result was. Yeah.
Which goes back to you'd have to say return null.
Yeah.
I don't know why Kevin liked return null over return 0, but whatever. I guess allocating a reference one means they get to be shared. Did I miss anything from chat?
Kevin says ship it.
Okay. Boop. Alright. Tanner, do you want to talk about get pinned handle for tensors, or do you want to postpone that to next week?
Postpone it till next week.
Okay.
For all the tensor ones.
Add schema URL support 63651. That's old.
Yes. So yeah, in the open telemetry, I mean in the telemetry in general, while you are publishing any telemetry data like through tracing or metrics, you can, I mean, like today the publishers like the application code or library code can put anything there, I mean in the telemetry data, and the issue is like the parties that collecting this telemetry data, I mean listening and collecting this telemetry data, they are creating some assumption about like what to expect to be there and what is the format of the data there. So it's very loose contract between the publisher and the collectors. So OpenTelemetry is introducing schemas. I mean the schema is kind of optional. I mean like you don't have to specify it, but it will be good to specify it while you are creating like activity source or meter. So the schema can have like exact kind of exact data that it's publishing from this app, and also the format of this data. So the collectors can just like read this schema and can understand what is the data there and what is the format they expect according to some semantic convention. I mean like it's defined by OpenTelemetry. So the proposal here is just like adding a new field for the activity source and meter constructors to accept this telemetry schema URL. So the runtime is not going to do anything with this URL at all. It will not validate anything. It will not read it. It will not do anything. It's just like passing. If the collector want to get it, I mean, they can get it from the activity source or meter, and the collectors can decide to do whatever they want with the URL. I mean, to open it or read it and confirm the data is applied according to specs or whatever. I mean, like, so this is part of OpenTelemetry specification. I mean, like, this is why we need to support it, and also there is other parties, I mean, waiting for this. They want to use it, and this will be good, I mean, to support it, so we can enable this scenario for people waiting for it.
The very last comment in the thread talks about the format of a schema URL.
Yeah.
Does this mean that you're also validating the URL against that format, or that this really is just an opaque string?
No, it's just a string. I mean, like,
Okay.
we will not do any validation for either for the string itself, the URL itself, or even the content of the URL.
So
We
it
will
doesn't
not-
even have to be a legal URL then?
Yeah, I mean, it can be anything.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay. Seems reasonable.
So you actually have a longer constructor that takes tags. Do you not need to combine the schema URL and tags?
That's a good question. Yeah, I didn't look at the one which is taking the tags, but it makes sense. I mean, like, to have it with the tags. So
Is there, if we're not doing anything special with this, is there something special about this data? Like, whether it's tags or baggage or something else, like, is there a reason this can't just be an arbitrary value in one of those key value stores and then
Yeah,
tell
but
it to
how-
pull it out?
yeah, I mean, so most of the data is key value pairs. I mean, like, but the question is, like, the collectors, how they know the format and what to expect to be there. Like, for example, about like HTTP. I mean, like, HTTP need to produce like the URL that of the request or something like this. I mean, so the collector need to expect, like, yeah, they need to find the URL in this data, and this is the format of the URL and how they parse it and so on. So the schema is helping in this scenario.
Right, I understand that. But like, there are other activity source constructors or something that take dictionaries or enumerables of key value pairs, right?
Yeah, this is the tags, but this is the static tags. I mean, this is not something that it send with every request. It's just like some kind of key value pair helpers that it's tied to the source itself, not for every
But
request.
let me change to what I'm really asking, which is,
Okay. Sorry.
is there going to be in 3 months, is there going to be another piece of data that we're going to be adding a new constructor for and a new property for, or should we be thinking about adding another dictionary to activity source that's just all this metadata? And
So far, there is nothing in the radar about adding more stuff there, but of course, I mean, things can change in the future.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing Steve was asking, but not everybody's gonna have one of these schema URLs, and you say not everybody has tags, but why don't we just say that if you want a schema URL, you're a person who has tags, and there be a well-known tag of schema URL. Like you have an extensible bucket, it's the last parameter. If this is like super important and formal and needs to be easy to look up, then like you have a scenario. But if it's just like, oh, some extra data we're tagging along,
Yeah,
that's
it's
literally
just
your tags bucket.
okay. If we do that, so it has to be like well-defined way for even for the OpenTelemetry specs about like telling about whatever when you're creating your source. I mean, and passing tags. So you have to have a semantic convention for these tags, which is we don't have today.
Do tags, like, did I hear you say that by definition tags get sent with every piece of data?
No, the one that it's in the constructor, it's not get sent with every data. It's static on this source. So the collectors can get these tags just once and do whatever they want with it.
But the schema is also static for the source. As
Yes,
in,
it is.
it's an instance on the source, but doesn't change. So it sounds like it has the exact same lifetime as this tags parameter.
Yeah, but the point is like users are not expecting to find the schema inside these tags. I mean, if we do that, so this will be very special for our implementation, not other OpenTelemetry implementations.
Yeah, I mean, so the answer of instead of being passed through to the final answer, it wants to be handled by something in the middle, so it's different than a tag seems reasonable if that's the case. But if it's a thing that just gets passed through to the end, then it seems like it should just be a tag. Like the question is, how's it different from a tag?
I understand your point, but my point is like we don't have a schema for these tags itself to tell about like these tags can have URL that you can read it from these tags and get the URL schema.
But if you're just saying it's a
No.
string that you're not validating in any way, shape, or form, then your property doesn't say that either. Your property can be the string hello world, which is not a valid URI of any kind.
It's not about validating, it's about finding it. So if you are using like any other platform like Java, I mean they don't pass this URL in tags, and people will expect to have like property to get this schema URL. But what we are saying here is like add this URL, this schema URL to these tags, and users has to understand, oh, okay, so we are running with .NET, so we can get this from the tags, and this will be special case for our implementation. This is the difference. I mean, like, why we don't have it in tags. The other idea we can do here, if we are concerned about like we can have like options options object that you can use while creating the activity source and meter. I think we have one for the meter. I don't remember. But so instead of adding a lot of parameters to the constructor, we can have just one object that you can pass, and we can add to this object as we need.
Is the special thing about schema, telemetry schema URL, just that it's one thing that everyone agrees on? Like if we were to instead of adding public string telemetry schema URL, if we added public string telemetry schema URL key name, is that, and then you would just use that to determine which of the tags was the schema. Is that the same, or like does putting it into the tag somehow mess up existing scenarios?
It's yeah, I mean, like, so it will be the whole point is like would be like we are not 100% conforming with this OpenTelemetry specs.
Okay, so so there's something in the specs that is very clear about what tags is, and that's what we'd be messing up.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, so far, I mean, it's not really defining what exactly you can find inside the tags, but it doesn't tell like you can find like schema URL inside the text. It doesn't tell that. And the recommendation in the specification is telling like you need to add this as something to the source itself.
I see. Okay. If you think that we're not going to see another one of these, then adding another constructor.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I mean, in the future, I mean, like if we got more things to add to the constructor, I would say like we will start creating like options object or something, like a property bag that can be passed to the constructor, so we don't have to add more parameters.
That would have properties on it for version tags.
Yeah, right. And yeah, schema
schema.
URL, and yeah, that's right. Actually, for meter, we already have meter options, I believe. Yeah.
So you're saying for meter, you want to put it on meter options instead of the constructor?
Yeah, we can do that if we need to, yeah.
But then do you still want the property on meter? I guess yes, because it doesn't expose the
Yeah,
options after.
yeah, we still need to have the property, yes.
Alright, so it looks like previously you did the optional parameters pattern wrong. And that you have two things that have optional parameters. This one you marked editor browsable never, but still left the default. So you need to remove the default from it. Then now you have the existing longest one that you need to mark EB never and remove the defaults from. And then now we get the new longer one that will default the parameter. If you think it's important to have an accelerated constructor, we can add an accelerated constructor. But I don't know what shape you would think that should be in, given that you already have another string property or version.
Yeah, either way, it's fine.
So I think that's what we want.
Yeah, this looks good to me. Oh, yeah, okay. I was just looking at the meter option. Yeah, it should be getter and setter. Yes, right. Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
And just to clarify, empty string is the correct default, not null. because it's a nullable property.
That was me writing the default wrong.
Yeah, okay.
Is there a difference between null and default for a string?
Then the literal default? No. We just tend to write null when it's an object and default when it's a value. Null is shorter. But they both mean 0. So chat asks, given that for meter we just said great, we have an options type, we're gonna not add a constructor. Chat is asking, why don't we make a activity source options now so we can get out of the business of making new constructors?
Yeah, this is other option we can do. I mean, like we will need to define the new object like activity source options. I'm open for this also. I mean, like that's fine too.
How does that make you feel, Steve?
I'm fine adding an options type.
Okay, so that would instead be that we leave all the existing constructors alone. And then I guess we get
Should be get and set, I believe. Oh, for name? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I got it now.
yeah.
That's fine. Yeah.
I guess meter options made it get set, but also made it be a required constructor parameter, which
Yeah,
seems weird.
that's
So I think it's that. Presumably options is what we called this, the other one.
yeah. I think options.
Yep.
Yeah, options.
So do we like this better?
Yeah, looks good.
Good. Then I get to get rid of diff.
Do we tend to seal options classes or leave them unsealed?
Meter options is unsealed.
Okay, so this just follows the same pattern. Okay.
meter options notably has a settable name property, despite requiring it as a constructor. I guess if everything else is mutable.
Yeah, I mean, if we can make it settable to match meter options, but unless anybody can explain why we did it that way on meter options, I mean, maybe it's because the DI options, autofact, builder stuff can't handle constructor parameters, but I mean, if that's the case, it couldn't instantiate the type because it doesn't have a default constructor. So,
Yeah, the only usage for the settable if somebody created the object once and use it multiple times. This would be the only benefit to use it, but I'm not expecting many people doing that. Or
yeah.
It is funny though, like we're one property away from that working, just like everything else is settable. It's consistent with the other type. Like
Fair
it's
enough.
consistent with the other properties.
Fair enough. It seems odd, but fine. I guess it's the only way that they can say that name is not null is by requiring it as a constructor parameter and then blocking it in the set.
You don't want to do a required property on there,
I think they care
and
about
then just remove the constructor.
historically care about net standard, which I think
Fair.
they can't do that there.
yeah,
Fair.
Besides, activator.createInstance doesn't care about required.
Hopefully, you're not activating
I'm-
options class.
I'm just saying required does not mean required. Required means the
True.
compiler will nag you if you don't do this, but it actually
Yeah.
is one of the easy. I mean, you can also do null bang, so I guess it's an easy way to get the nullable annotations to lie.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Seems like we're happy with. Yep. I put it as get only on both things, which I think is correct. I got that from somewhere. All right. Completely replacing the notes. All right. Show Tarek. Why don't you close the tab? Why are you selecting other words? Dear computer. Oh my god, Teams. It's the you're sharing your screen was too close to the tab close button, so it was intercepting the mouse click. Alright. No one's here for that. We're skipping that, so we're on to future. Alright, more memory extension methods accepting search values of t 109859. Anyone want to talk about this one?
I can about the intention behind it. I'm not sure about how common of a usage it would be. Essentially, we already have a bunch of method groups on memory extensions, right? Index of any contains any and count for one value. This would be adding the count of any for multiple values. This is something that search values can factorize more than you can trivially do yourself. But as far as I remember, at least in our own libraries, I don't remember usages where we necessarily needed this.
I mean, there are places where I can remember a couple places thinking, oh, if I had a count to replace here, I would use it. Replace is typically you've got a bunch of, a bunch of characters that you want to normalize, like a bunch of invalid You've got some string and you're passing it off to something that only allows incoming alphabet and numbers, and so you want to find a bunch of other things and replace them with underscore or whatever. But I don't know.
Are you talking about the replace any specifically?
Yeah, replace any.
Okay, yeah, I meant the count of any. From what
Yeah.
I've seen, our usages, we essentially went in a different direction of building up a list of all the indices of the things you're looking for. For example, if you want to remove them. So by building up a list, you already know the count. I didn't look at the other overloads here that were proposed.
Wait, is there an existing count of any method? Is that what you're saying? Just having trouble
Yes.
finding it.
There's an existing count method that takes a single t, and it also takes a read-only span of t that acts as a single entity, like a string.
Oh. I'm looking at string, not memory extensions. That's why I can't find it. Okay.
Presumably it would be count any and not count of any, but
Or could you get away with count because search values implies of any?
Yeah, I don't like the any suffix here just because every other place that any exists, that the any suffix exists, it means like we look for any element that matches the search values and then we stop. Whereas this is you actually look at every element, not any element.
well, like split any effectively does a find all of the things, find all that are any of the things, and do something for each of them.
Okay.
I wish we just called it split.
We can't because it needs to differentiate a sequence of things to know whether they're to be treated as a unit or as individual values.
Well, I mean, it's the problem is that you're overloading it also with the read-only span. If it didn't have an overload, if it was just search values, then that would have said, "I am the any."
Right, exactly.
And that
But
could explain the difference because we're not calling it trim any, I hope.
No, trim historically has always just said any element in this set is a trim thing.
That's fair. There's more precedent there, but we don't have an any suffix there.
No, but it's its own thing. Like I only weakly care about getting rid of any on the count of any, but like it makes the pattern match everything else that's on the type, so I just leave it. As much as it pains me to say that.
I don't have a strong opinion about it. I don't like the of, but the any I could probably go either way. I think with a slight preference towards having it.
I agree, get rid of.
If you get rid of the any, then you get rid of the second overload.
What is this? Don't we already?
Because you have a
Don't
count.
we already have the second overload?
You have a count that takes a span and a read-only span value. But
but we don't have one that allows that span to be treated as individual values.
No, that's what the any would be, right?
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I think that's saying that's the letting the t be the span be find this sequence of values as opposed to find this.
So I think then that second one would have to be any, and if that second one's any, I think we'd want the first one to be any to be consistent with it because it has the same semantics.
Right. Or you could just cut the second one and say if they want the any, they have to use the search values.
Yeah.
Miha, from an implementation perspective, I seem to remember each one of these methods that we added either had a less than ideal implementation or required a crap load of code to make it efficient. Am I remembering correctly?
Yeah, that's pretty much it, yeah. For count specifically, I think we could get away with specializing it for fewer types than we do for index of any. But yeah, it's still a lot of code.
Otherwise, the simple implementation would just be basically an index of any loop, right?
Right.
Yeah, we also already have contains any and contains any except, so more any's. I think any's here to stay.
Yeah, the any is a really nice way of saying like this is not a string. This is just a set of individual elements.
Do we need? So there's like contains any in range. Would we do count any in range? Nah.
God. Count and then count any except, and like there's a whole set.
So they do have count any except in this proposal, right? Or count of any except that we
Oh,
need the
okay, I didn't see that.
For count of any except, I'm not sure we really need it because it's logically source.length minus count.
Right.
The other option for the accepts is we do the thing we've talked about in the past, which is support creating an inverted search values.
Right.
Okay, so count of any becomes count any, and we keep the search values and the param span. Are you saying even though you proposed count of any except you don't want it?
I'm not actually sure who marked this as ready, but yeah, I don't particularly care to add the except because it doesn't add anything really.
And after all, we're not adding replace any except, so which would be where you make the allow list of valid characters and tell it replace everything else with an underscore or what have you.
That one's at least arguably useful.
Yeah,
But yeah.
that one.
Yeah.
I'm right.
Well,
It's replace any except would have a useful thing, but it wasn't being proposed here. So if count any except is felt as less useful than that, then we should not add it.
We added contains any except, even though the logic is almost as trivial as what Miha just mentioned a few minutes ago.
I think it
Doesn't the
changes on the
short
empty
circuiting
string.
make it hard?
Right, that's the difference. You need to do a length check in addition to just saying did it return false.
And then, yeah, as Stefan said,
It's still a one-liner.
it's still a one-liner, but it could change the. While it's still going to be O in, it could be a much smaller in.
Yeah.
If it's early terminating instead of run the whole thing to find out contains any said false.
Yes.
So return true.
That's true. That is true. Complexity is different.
Okay, so count any and so count any seems fine. Replace any, we're saying if you have a span, we can do it inline, and if you want to write to a different destination, because span is now convertible to read-only span through an extension call, we don't need two forms of the destination writing one.
Yeah, we're done adding overloads just to eliminate the cast.
Yep.
Yay.
But for trim, we either need all four, or we should be returning index. Sorry, returning range instead of a span.
Is trim really valuable here? I mean, most of the situations I've seen with trim, the number of things that you're trimming off the beginning and end is very small. The benefit of search values would be if there was just a ridiculous number of things at beginning and end, or a large number of things beginning and end, that search values would optimize finding the first thing that wasn't one of the things to be trimmed. Is that a useful scenario in general, or is this just squaring the circle or circling the square or whatever we say?
I'm not seeing many people doing that. I mean, like
This feels a little bit like the index of white space thing where
Right. Yeah.
We're not sure that it's actually valuable. Yeah, I'm kind of looking to you for your. Oh, sorry, Lydia, go ahead.
I was going to ask, like, is there not do we not expose the search values of char that is white space?
No.
We debated that. We have we still could. There was a proposal that I'd opened for an index of any white space, an index of any except white space, and during that we discussed maybe we should just have a search values dot white space property, which we could certainly do.
Instead of a search values white space or something like that, should it potentially be a search values for Unicode character classification so that you can specify ZS versus something else?
You mean like a create method that takes a Unicode specification?
Yeah, that way you don't have to have specifically the concept of like, because I think one of the problems is that many people have different expectations of what is white space versus not. Like, some people consider new lines white space, others don't. And so, if you simplify it down to some at least standardized terminology like the Unicode character classification, then we at least have a solid way to explain what it is.
I get concerned that we're starting to get really close to the regex territory, which already provides that exact support, and
That's fair.
I wouldn't want to search values that represented the 50,000 characters that make up the word class or whatever it is.
Right.
Yeah.
It also means that you're discarding like everything that's outside of 2-byte characters. Like for white space, that's okay because white space, I believe, is defined to exist within the basic plane. But once you start saying arbitrary classes, like everything gets thrown out the window at that point.
Because you need to lift to rune at that point.
Yeah. Which means that you now have to take into account the characters that came before you or after you. And looking at characters in isolation just breaks.
Yeah, I mean, if we thought it was useful to do things by Unicode class, then making search values of char accelerators that took the Unicode class as an input would seem fine. We don't need them all hanging off of things as well-known lookups.
Yeah.
But that would be a fundamentally different proposal.
Yeah. I think it is an interesting proposal, to be fair. I just don't know if I think it's different enough, like Jeremy said, that we probably don't want to really discuss it here.
Would trim accept be something people want?
Maybe, but at that point, I think what you probably would end up doing is having index of index of any and index of any last, and then just slicing yourself at that point. Because the scenario for a trim accept would basically be like, oh, I have, some string colon some other string, and I want to get rid of everything before the first colon, for instance. But that's an index of operation and the slice operation, right?
I'm looking for PIM. Trim everything that's not hyphens.
Yeah.
But think about the code golf. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the trim, given the index of any and last index of any, and then the accepts exist. Trim, start, and trim end, they're all trivial, and if we add them, we need to either add them in the shape that people don't want, where it's returning range, or we need to add 4 of each, because if you call this one with a mutable span, it's giving you back a read-only span. So we need the one that says if a mutable span comes in, a mutable span comes out. And similar for mutable memory.
My preference would be to just drop trim from this proposal and come back to them if we really see a strong need.
Yep. I agree. But it sounds
These
like
are-
we
these are
like
useful.
replace any.
Yeah, replace any is useful.
We've discussed there being utility for replace any except. Do we want to add it at this time or wait until somebody actually argues for it?
Replace any. The scenarios that I've seen for replace any are more for replace any except because they're sanitization. It's like anything other than the alphabet replaced with an underscore.
Right.
And so the search values would be for the alphabet, not for the other 60,000 characters. So I think either we need to replace any except, or we need to add support for creating an inverted search values.
We already have a lot of accept APIs that take search values, right?
We do.
So it would be a little weird to have two kind of ways, but interesting. But yeah, I would say for now, stick with the pattern.
We arrived at those because we end up with we had the notion of except because there were things that weren't being specified via search values. So contains any except with a single character, contains any except with two characters, contains any except in range where you're specifying a range of characters. And then when we added the search value support as well, it was natural for it to be contains any except search values. I'm fine continuing the except trend here. I don't think it's harmful. It's just more. It's probably the right answer for now. Maybe separately we think about whether we want to revisit the idea of. Yeah.
All right. So for replace any, the proposed old values and new value made sense and sounds familiar with what I expect like string.replace to say. Replace any except it. Old values might make. I guess old values and new value might make sense. I preemptively renamed it to replacement value, but
Old value and new value still makes sense to me. But tell me why they shouldn't. What was the connotation that I'm missing?
Because here old values are actually the values that will not change because that's the except.
Yeah.
And that's
you could do like kept values,
yeah.
retained values.
And then once old values was being renamed, the new value seemed to need to be renamed too. But while I had a good name for new value, I didn't have one for old, so I didn't type yet.
I mean, it would be like excluded values or something.
Well, it would actually be retained values or kept values, or just values.
Right. It's all a matter of
That's what I
perspective.
meant. Excluded from replacement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's in all fours.
I mean, you could literally just call it search values with a lowercase s. Like these are the things that you're searching for, and anything that's not what you're searching for gets replaced.
And that makes it
I would
search
say these
and replace.
work for the other one too, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, we might as well keep them for both if we think it's good.
What do we call this parameter for contains any and all those?
I
Just
think it's
values.
always values.
Yeah, contains any except it's just values.
Do we just do values?
Yeah.
That works too.
And then do we want new value, replacement value?
I'd be inclined to use the existing replace methods use new value.
Okay.
Mhm.
I'd be inclined to just go with that, unless we really don't like it for some reason.
Like I said, in my head, I guess once old values just becomes values, it makes sense. But if old values was like preserved values, then new value just felt slightly out of place to me because it pairs really well with old, but not with other things. So do we want
Will
to?
we use old values? Yeah, in the other overload.
Yeah. So do we want to make these just be values?
What do existing replace methods do?
They just take they take old value, singular.
I think old values is fine for the non-accept one.
Since we're talking about all the new method groups, would we want remove any? I mean, at least from what I've seen, replace is often used with empty string to just remove everything that's invalid. Would that apply here?
Would you return a length or something, or the span? Would be like trim.
Well, there's no
Yeah.
remove method, so you'd be introducing remove any except.
And would it like compact? Is that the idea? Like it would shorten the length of the output?
Yeah, I'm not saying we actually need it, but yeah.
Yeah, because Steve mentioned earlier that replacing non-characters with underscores, for instance, is one way to sanitize. Another way to sanitize literally is to remove those characters.
Right. We've
So
actually had
yeah.
we've had separate requests for remove any, right? Or we have the version, like a lot of people end up using the string-based replace with a single character as a string old value and an empty string new value.
Yep.
For that reason, right?
I see people do that with base 64 all the time, where they're trying to remove the characters at the very end, the equal characters. I mean, they should just be calling trim, but whatever.
Right.
So remove is like ultra trim though, and this would be like remove all. It would like trim in the middle.
How?
I remember what they're doing. They're removing white space as well. That's why it's not just a trim all.
Yeah, the most common place I've seen it was before we added the convert to hex string, that they'd call bit converter to string on the bytes dot replace the string hyphen with the empty string to get rid of the hyphens that it introduced because it thinks it's formatting a MAC address.
Yep.
You could have like remove except, or except for you probably call it like keep or something like that. It's the naming gets a little interesting because like people might assume remove removes a single element too, right?
Yeah. But at that point, you kind of the whole should it be any or all starts to percolate back up to the top, because you're not removing any occurrence of a match, you're removing all occurrences of a match.
You're removing all in.
Right. Exactly.
Remove all of any. Yeah.
Yes. Or you're counting all occurrences of any character within the string or within the search value. So yeah.
No, I definitely see what you're talking about though, with like people like uber trimming like base 64 stuff or whatever, want to remove the white space in the middle and so forth. It's definitely a scenario.
What would the pattern be that we'd follow? Because you'd be shrinking. Well, you'd possibly be shrinking, possibly growing. So which of our patterns would we use for how it would be exposed?
It couldn't grow, right?
If you replace it with a longer value.
If you replace it with
you're talking.
That would be replace. If it's
okay.
just removed, then it would only shrink.
Yes.
But we're talking like an arbitrary replace too, so you could have arbitrary length, whether it be 0 items or more than
but even
one.
if it was just remove, it would shrink. So would we return how would we return the new length? Is that what we think we would do?
Wouldn't this be
it'd be like
operation
trim,
status at
right?
that point?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it doesn't have to be operation status. You could always do it in one go. If you know it's the remove thing, right? Where, like, it would be a bit like trim, right? Where I think the original proposal was to return the span. And then there would have to be like 4 overloads, like Jeremy was saying, so you don't lose the read-only / mutability-ness.
Right.
And then you'd have to decide what you do with the characters kind of like past the end of the span. I assume you like default them out or something.
Yeah, like
I don't know.
That one's easy. Which is you return the number of items written. The in place one of
In the in-place one could be the same, just return
of
return
that
the length of
would be how, yeah, I think it would return the int of this is now the final semantic position in the span.
So you wouldn't do as
feels
the
weird.
trim proposal did, where you actually return a new span, which is probably fair.
Yeah, I mean, again, making it return int means it can be used for all 4 shapes.
Yeah. And trim was unique in that, like, it doesn't actually have to mutate any content, so it could work on read-only span and return a new read-only span in theory.
Right, because trim, the problem is both the double-sided trim is it can change both your offset and your length. Remove would presumably keep the 0 element in the same place, and then just change the length if it's doing in place remove. So yeah, I think the pattern on that one would make sense to be int returning if we wanted it. Are we actually proposing doing it here, or are we just thinking ahead?
Thinking ahead.
Okay.
We should actually have some real examples of where we do, but I do think this would get some use. And as Levi said, he had examples. I've seen examples, but we'd want to make sure we got it right.
Yeah, because returning an int almost makes it sound like this is a number of items that you removed. So we would need to think through that a little bit more.
The other wrench here, and this might be a question for Miha, that these will only work with our byte and char support as they're currently exposed. We would need dedicated support for read-only for search values of string.
Right, yeah, because the types on those overloads are different. Because
I mean,
right, those
the shapes that we have here, like you can only use search values of string on a span of string.
right, but would you want to use the search values of string on a span of char?
Right, and that would require
A dedicated overload. That's my
new
point.
overloads. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought you were saying would require like plumbing work, and that would require API.
Are there examples of memory extensions APIs that have that shape right now?
Yeah, the index of and contains ones.
Yeah.
There are overloads that are specific for search values of string, and the T in the span is then a char instead of a string.
What's going to make replace more complicated is that you're mutating something and potentially also expanding it while mutating it.
Yes.
So that'll be unique.
Well, and you run into the issue with replace that you could then easily grow because your new value is going to be a string that could be larger than the thing that you're replacing.
Yeah.
I mean, like
The fact that
string dot replace does that. It does the count of hits and then.
Yeah, we would maintain the same semantics as string dot replace, but string dot replace allocates a new string. Here we're writing into a destination, so we would need to have the concept of, like, it would need to be an operations status or something.
Yeah. So I get operation status would let you say this is as far as I could make it safely, and then you ran out of space. Versus throwing of, well, I did the math and your destination's not big enough.
Right, and then and then the operation status requires the signature to also have outs for how far you made it, and so, yeah, maybe that's a concern for another day. But Miha, did you open this issue initially?
No. I saw that it was on the API review, so I joined. For the count, if we were to add the string-based overload, that would also bring in the discussion again of what's our policy of which values match. Like, if you have values and 1,000 A's, how many are there?
Right. Yeah. Now we're again. This is I'm paging this all back in now. We punted all this to regex because there was policy involved.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a reason I always put rainbows around the word policy whenever I write it in chat.
The more you know. The issue here is search values can contain strings that overlap. So there are different ways that search values could match in an incoming string, and regex defines very clear semantics for what that way is, but we'd have to adopt similar semantics here. So forget I mentioned search values of string at all.
Right before I forget that, does the search values of string encode the equality in addition to having the overlap problem?
Yeah,
Okay.
you specify ordinal or ordinal ignore case.
Gotcha.
Well, you specify any string comparison, but we throw if you give it something other than ordinal or ordinal ignore case.
Sure, but the case sensitivity is embedded itself within the search values.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess, does it do? And so then it does Unicode code point matching, not Unicode normalization matching. So the
Right.
the
Right.
Arabic script _1 and the ASCII 1 would never match because you're not running it through the thing that says they're the same.
I think our ordinal semantics are nothing ASCII ever matches ignore case with something non-ASCII.
Right.
Depends on who you ask. Yes. There are APIs in the framework that say they can match. There are APIs that say they can't match.
Yeah.
Really?
But I
Which
just
ones
meant
say they can match?
Yeah.
I just meant search values never encodes that. Not our ordinal thing doesn't encode that.
Yeah, and we heavily really rely on that for perf.
Which ones say they can match, Levi? Just some obscure thing, or is it something mainstream?
I believe. I'll send it in chat. But I believe
curious.
that I opened up a bug a few years ago that said like, hey, these two things don't match.
But we definitely rely on that in string itself and in search values.
Yeah, I'll find the issue and I'll ping you in chat.
Just since we have all the methods here, I just looked through the issues. The only other method groups that people have asked for so far with search values is starts with and ends with any.
Isn't that just that?
Yeah, it's a length check and then a
Yeah, okay.
contains, except for string. That's where it can actually be useful. But yeah, we can punt that.
I guess while it is numerically equivalent to index of is 0, it goes back again to the
Algorithmically complexity-wise, it's...
Yeah, do you get to say, all I have to do is look at 0 and then keep going while there's a match, versus I have to get to the end before I tell you.
That one just saves you a couple... It's basically, is the length greater than 0 and does search values contains string sub 0?
Yeah, for
so
bytechar, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fair enough. I mean, do we want to add that here, or we want to say not until somebody proves it's valuable enough?
I'd be fine skipping it. I think the only really useful one is the string one, and that's more complicated, so you can...
So the notes move to here, and then we will be out of time. Alright, so we removed the of in count of any, we removed count of any except entirely, we removed the proposed trims, and then we kept replace any as proposed with old values and new value, and then we added replace any except with values and new value.
Just remembered seeing my comment there. We've added overloads with equality compares to everything. Would we do that here as well?
Where have we been adding them?
Steven, I believe you've added that recently of just
Sorry,
adding
what did I add? I was listening.
overloads that take equality compare.
Yes, but what would that mean with search values?
Nothing, but for the
So
span-based thing.
Oh, for that one.
for this one of overloading it, okay, so the replaces, because they're only search values, it wouldn't come up, but you're saying for count any, do we want a span, comma, values, comma, comparer?
Yeah, I think we probably do. And that one Normally we do it as an optional parameter, but because of the params, we would do it as a dedicated overload.
Would you leave it
It'd be
as nullable and optional?
It would be nullable but non-optional. And we would drop the constraint on the T.
Because I quality compare gave it to you.
Right. But I think that's what we would do. There's no reason for this to be optional, because if you weren't specifying it, you would just pick up the params.
So wait, we have the generic constraint for when you don't specify a quality compare, but the last overload's nullable but doesn't have the generic constraint. Is that just going to be like
Actually, that's a good point.
error?
No, that's a good point. We probably want it to be nullable for the case where T is... Well, I mean, we're going to have a difference regardless, because you'll never be able to specify a non-equatable T without the params. But yeah, we probably do want to make the compare nullable for the case where T is not I-equatable. You'll still have to specify the span, though. You won't be able to specify it as individual values.
So do we need to modify it at all?
Yes, change the compare to compare equals no.
Okay, so we do want it to be defaulted, but we don't need the constraint?
Correct.
Okay. This overload will preclude you from ever adding the... Or sorry, it may not preclude it, but it will make it interesting and complicated of the... if you wanted a special case, read-only span of char and search values of string. I guess no, unless search values is implicitly convertible from a T, which I don't think it is. So never mind.
Steven dropped.
Fair enough. I was just because if you had a read-only span of char and then you had a single string that you passed in here, it would look like well, actually it looked more like this one, but I think it'll call this one because it can do it with the non-params call pattern. So it would hit one of these two already, and then if you added the one that, if it took a string somewhere else, then it would bind to the new one. But if search values isn't implicitly convertible from T, which I hope it isn't, then it wouldn't be an issue. So, all right.
Yeah, I guess what you're saying is that count any comma literal string would have these are the characters instead of this is a single value. So that would be kind of weird.
Yeah, but I mean that's just going to be true anyway.
That's basically the same as trim, right?
Yeah, it's either going to hit one of these two. I think it'll call this one. And it'll just be like, yep, you gave a span and you asked count any in the string hello. Well, the second L is redundant. It'll tell you how many times H, E, L, or O occur. You called count any. Get over it. Alright. I mean, as usual, if you find it's wonky once you write it, you can always not add it. So.
Yep. Thanks. Sorry for being confused at the start. I only looked at the count in the proposal.
No worries. Alright. So, marked as approved. And, yeah, I think we had good discussion in chat, so thanks everybody for participating. Even the non-technical discussion about languages at the beginning. Those are fun, though of course not what we're here for. And yeah, we still have a lot of stuff, but at least it doesn't scroll anymore. So either way, there's no BCL meeting this Thursday, so we'll see you same .NET time on our same .NET channel next week, where we'll mostly be talking about tensors. Until then, auf Wiedersehen.